Hello and welcome to CSS Hybrid video number 2, Selection Techniques. I'm Scott McLeod. We'll be looking at a variety of ways to select parts of your document in order to apply some formatting to it. These techniques are pretty important in your ability to format your web pages and websites because if you can't select the elements that you like, then you will not have the ability, of course, to format them. So pretty fundamental to our eventual design capabilities. And we are going to look at a variety of ways to do things selection-wise. We're going to first of all take a look at the folder Video 2 Selection, which you should all have in hand. And there is a single file. It's an online resume called resume.html. That's the file that we're going to be working with. We start from the vantage point we see here in the browser, Joe Student's resume. It's a very plain resume, not a lot of formatting at all, just the basic H1, H2 paragraph, H2 unordered list, H2, H3 unordered list, etc. Scroll down and see the remainder of the resume. We can see other sections with similar structure, H2 for experience, H3 for sales manager, and so forth. And then towards the bottom we have an H2 for the references section, an ordered list finally, a couple of links, these are mail to links, and then finally the person's contact information, which also includes a mail to. So there's 3 links. These links will help us to see how to select them, to format them better. You can see if we start talking about the weaknesses in the look of this resume right now, the links kind of stand out awkwardly. They don't do anything when you mouse over them. I think we have difficulty in seeing the structure for what it is because there's pretty big headings sitting right next to each other all over the place in this area. I think we could benefit from changes in indenting, margins, colors, etc. to try to set things off and give this document some style, make it look more professional. We can do some things with the heading to make it look a little more stylish, perhaps focus on the objective a little bit more, and then somehow highlight the main details of the resume and separate it more effectively from the bottom area here. Okay, and to see how we are going to end up at the end of the day here, this is our solution. This is where we're headed. This is what we hope to do. You do not have this file to play with at the moment, so you can just look at the result here. You see we've played some games with color here. Our headings are in dark red and the body of the document is in black. We have a little bit of style to the J and the S of Joe Student there, and we have a little box here. We've bolded the objective area to stress it, and then we've got this little box area that sets off details. We also have a much better indentation in these areas to help see the structure a little bit better, and you can see that we have separated the last portion from the references area much better. We also have done some work on the links. You can see that the underlining is not there, tended to make it look a little bit overblown, and that comes into play only when you mouse over at this point, as you can see on all 3 of those links. So those are the formatting changes. Gives it a little bit more professional appearance. Okay, so that's what we're headed for. What we're going to do now is open up the CSS HTML validator and open up the file that we were just looking at. That may be in a different folder for you. For me, I've placed it on the desktop in the Video 2 Selection folder. I have that resume.html file. This is what it looks like. And we have a blank style area that we need to fill in. And I am going to change my editor options to make it a little bit more easy for you to see. I'll just bold and kick up the font a little bit. This is not something you need to do. I think it'll just help your visibility as we continue here. Alright, we're going to begin by giving the body some styles. So we begin with the most basic of all selectors, which is a body tag selector. We're going to give the page itself some margins. We're going to go margin left, and we're going to use a percentage. This way, if the screen is wider in some users than others, it'll be a consistent look of 10%. I'm going to give the margin right, same amount, and let me change the way I'm going to format this since we're going to have multiple properties. I'm going to try to keep them all lining up nicely. So we go margin right, also 10%, and we're going to give the background color, and we're going to use this combination. It's EE EECC. That's the sort of khaki background. And the color of the text will be black. And that concludes our body tag adjustments. Let's save and take a look at our result. I'm going to go ahead and preview this page. Okay, if I maximize the browser window, you can see our margins in effect here. The 10% really gives a much wider margin area on both sides. This is appropriate. After all, this document is not very wide. Details are pretty much narrow, and so having a large left margin helps to set that off and give a better presentation. In addition, the background color is there for us, and the black obviously is our default color anyway, but still a good idea to set that. Right, I'm going to minimize the browser and come back to it as we develop more. The next section I want to do is to change the headings. I want to affect H1, H2, and H3 headings, and so rather than write separate rules for each, one of the selection techniques here is to use commas to separate, and your properties will affect all three of those headings as they appear. We're going to change the font family here. We're going to give the headings a little bit more style. The font family, the font list I'm going to use is Garamond, Georgia, and then serif. I want it to be a serif look, and I'm also going to change the color. As we saw in the proposed final result, we had a dark red, and that dark red color is 660000, and that will conclude our settings for the headings. Now, some of you possibly may not have Garamond installed on your systems, in which case you may not see the same font I do. You may, for example, instead see Georgia. If for some strange reason you don't have either one of those, then you'd see whatever the default serif is. So it is possible you may not see exactly what we do when we go to the browser with this, but for most of you those are fairly common fonts. So let's take a look at the differences. You can see our headings are now that deep red, and they also have a different look to them. You can see obviously the J in Joe is a different look from the standard Times New Roman that we were looking at previously, which is the default serif font. Alright, let's continue now with some further additions to our document and get into some of these more advanced selection techniques. So below our headings, we're going to now work on a paragraph. What I want to do is emphasize that objective area, and if we look at our HTML, I'm talking about affecting this objective area here. It's a paragraph beneath the H2 for objective. So we're going to start by using the P selector, the P tag selector, and for that I'm just going to change the font weight and make that bold. Let's see, to be consistent, I'm going to bring that over and save. And what we're going to find is, by the way, that this P selector is going to select more than we want. And we're going to have to come back and fix that. But let's see. It does appear to have bolded the objective. The problem is that if you scoot down to the bottom, you can see that it has also bolded the address. There's no reason why the address should be emphasized so much like that. So here's the problem with using tag selectors. You can't get very specific. Every P has to get the same formatting, and that's not what we want here. So we have to go to a different technique in order to say we want to select this paragraph but not others. And to do that, we use classes and IDs, and they actually have to be placed into the tags themselves in order for us to properly select them. I mean, we have to have some way of telling the browser we want this P and not another one. So one way to do that would be to insert an ID into that paragraph tag. You can say ID equals, and then in quotes like any other attribute, give a name to that area that is descriptive. In this case, it seems to me the most descriptive thing to do would be to call it objective. And so the ID is equal to objective, and then we can come back up and we can change that from P to P pound objective. Pound sign is used for IDs. So what this says to the browser is select any P that has objective as its ID. Now in fact, an ID can only occur once in the HTML, so it can't possibly occur on any other type of tag. Therefore, simply pound objective is all we really need. Some people like to do p-pound objective, some people just pound objective. Either way, there can be no spaces between the pound and the O of objective. And whether or not you choose to put the P, in this case, since we have an ID in place, want to do it, it documents the fact that it is a P. Maybe that makes it easier for you to find it. If so, feel free to leave it on. It doesn't matter. At any rate, let's look if we were successful in the browser at selecting only the objective. Okay, you can see the objective is still bolded, and as we move down to the bottom, we can see that we have accomplished our selection need there. So IDs are useful when you have one and only one area that you need to pick out for the page. Then you put an ID in the tag and you use the pound as the indicator in your selection area. Let's move on. We want to now take the J in Joe. We're looking at the main heading for the page. The J in Joe and the S in student, so that it can be given a larger font size. Now here's a problem, because we can't just say H1. We can't say the first letter in H1 because it's Joe and student. So how do we select out just those characters? Well, the way to do that is to put a new tag nested in there, SPAN, not like the food spam, SPAM, but span, as it is spanning the area, like it spanned the globe. So it's SPAN. So we have an open and closing span tag inside the H1 to select out the J. And we'll do a similar span followed by a closing span around the S. Now, the span tag itself has absolutely no visual component. So if we save and view this in the browser, you will see no difference. As you see, Joe Student, there's nothing that the span is actually doing in terms of the browser displaying anything different. So the purpose of the span is simply to mark off sections of your page that you'd like to select. Now, I could give the spans themselves IDs or classes. Classes we'll be discussing in a moment. But in this case, these are spans that are inside the H1. We're not going to have any other spans in this area. So this is the only H1 in the document. It will always be the only H1. So I'm fairly safe to take this approach. And I'm actually going to put this, since it is involving the headers, I'll put it up near the other H1, H2, H3 selections. And we're going to do an H1 space span. Now what that means is when you have two different tag selectors like that and you have a space between them, not a comma, but a space, what you're saying is that you are selecting spans that appear inside H1s, which is exactly the ones that we just created. Alright, and the property that we want to use is font size. And what I'm able to do here is to give a relative size. Since we're inside the H1, we can give a percentage of increase that we want to give. And I'm going to give a 150%. If it's less than 100%, you're decreasing the size that would otherwise be given to the span. And in this case, we're increasing it. We're making it 1.5 times what it was before. And that should make the J and the S bigger. Let's see what that looks like. There's our big J and our big S. Okay, so that's a fairly common technique. Now, you use spans only when you are going inside a block, like an H1 or a P or any other heading, and you are trying to get part of a sentence or part of that paragraph. That's when the spans are used. Okay, let's move on. I'm going to use spans again. You may have noticed in the result that we're after that the colleges, Cal State Fullerton and our own Riverside Community College, were emphasized. Notice it is not the entire LI. Keep in mind these are unordered lists, so these are LIs. It's not the entire LI, it's just the college in both cases. So again, we're going to have to employ spans in here, and we want the same formatting to apply to both colleges. So again, we go to spans. We have to mark up the code a little bit. Right around that area and this area, we'll be putting spans. It will allow us to select out just the college. Let's put the other span in there around Riverside Community College and closing span. Now in this case, we could write a rule now that looks like LI space span, and that would work fine, except it's quite possible that there's some list in here elsewhere on the page or in the site where we might want to span off other parts of an LI for a different purpose to have different formatting. So I think it makes more sense in this case to put not an ID because we have more than one of them, but instead a class. And we can go class equal, and then we could give any name we want to, like school or college. I'll just say college. And we'll do that same class. I'm just going to copy and paste that same class attribute into the span opening span tag for RCC, class equal college. So we have class equal college in both places. And let's talk about the different selectors. As I was mentioning before, this selector would actually work without the class. But again, it's a little dangerous, and I don't recommend doing that because of all the possible LIs that could end up with different kinds of spans inside for different purposes. So much better to do either span dot college or just dot college. The dot is used for classes, much like the pound is used for IDs. And again, it is completely up to you whether you include the span part, just like it was optional to use the P part. The advantage is simply that it kind of documents itself. That dot college is just a few words spanned inside something. Now, we could be as specific as this, LI span dot college. But then again, we may have a college that appears somewhere else in the document that we want to have the same formatting, and it might be outside of an LI. So maybe it's even better if we just leave it like that. And now let's write the rule for the colleges. And the rule was going to be that we have a font style of italic and a font weight of bold both. Sometimes it's good to have this combination because italicized text can sometimes become harder to read. Instead of emphasizing it, you're actually de-emphasizing it. So combining that with bold can sometimes make it more readable. Let's finish off the bracket on that guy. And let's take a look at our colleges. Save and preview. There's the Cal State Fullerton and RCC. In fact, Cal State Fullerton does appear in this area as well. We could choose to either do another span.college or just leave it off. In this case, it's probably better to leave it off. Alright, let's continue. We also have an area that we wanted to give a different background color to, as we see in our proposed version, that from interests section all the way down to and including the references area, that all area has a different background color. It also has a little double border, you can see, as well as having a little bit of space here, and that we call padding inside that box. So we want to set up those properties. Now notice it's a pretty big area, and we're going to have to mark it up so that the browser knows where that area starts and ends. And you might be thinking, hey, span tags could do that. Start a span here and end the span down there. No, span tags, remember, are only used for inline elements that are inside a block, whereas this is covering multiple blocks. So we need a different type of marker, and that type of marker is called a div. It's supposed to start right after the objective, so we're going to put it here. The opening div tag would go there, and the closing div tag is going to go way down after the references, but before the paragraph that includes the contact information. And that's our closing div tag. This div goes from line 92 in my version here up to line 50, including all that area. Okay, so there's our div. Now we could write a rule at this point that just has div as its selector. Problem is, we may have other divs, and we will. So that will cause us to have boxes where we wouldn't want them. For now, let's leave it at div. We'll have to come in and change that later. For that div, we will be setting background color F8, F8, D8. That's our background color. To get the border, we're using, it's a double border. The color is CC, CC, I9, and its thickness is 3 pixels. You can actually give these 3 in any order you want. And let's stop at that point and see what we have. Well, we're pretty close to what we wanted. The differences between what we have here and what we wanted was that padding. See, we don't have any spacing here between these things, so we're going to put some padding in to take care of the spacing and make that look a little bit nicer. Another thing we're going to do there is to change the fonts in the box area from this current serif font to something sans serif to make it a little bit easier to read. Adding to that, padding all the way around inside the box, 10 pixels, and font family change to Geneva. If Geneva doesn't exist, we'll try Trebuchet MS. You might notice the quotes I've put on that. That's because it's a multiple word font. The font name itself is more than one word, therefore you use quotes. You don't put quotes around the whole list. You don't put quotes around single name fonts, only around double word fonts, that is. Sans serif. So this is a sans serif font. It's a non-decorative font, a little bit easier to read for smaller text. Sans serif, by the way, is one word because of the dash, so we don't need quotes on it. That concludes our div settings, and we can now take a look. Notice that we have the spacing we were after on the left side. Actually also spaced it down a little bit further than it was before. And at the bottom, we also have spacing that's appropriate there. We can't really tell the difference on the right side. Notice, however, now that this box doesn't extend all the way to the right edge of the page. Why is that? Because our body tag had 10% on the margin left and also had 10% on the margin right. And that's why we bothered to put it on the right, so that we could have a uniform look on the left and right, symmetrical look for the box. So we have achieved what we were after there. I did mention we were going to have to change this selector, but we don't need to change it yet, so we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. And the next thing I want to do is work on those links to make them look a little bit nicer. And links in this document occur as mail to links down towards the bottom in the references and the final section at the bottom of the resume. So here we start a:"link." That means anything that is an A tag and is a link. You might say that's all A's, isn't it? But it really isn't, because there are A's that are names only and don't have hrefs. And if you don't put :link, you'd be styling those, which you normally don't want. So a:"link is the normal status for a link. And we're going to color it blue. We're not going to change the default coloring so that users will most likely recognize it. And I'm going to go ahead and put a second property next to it. Text decoration. The text decoration property controls underlining, among other things, and we don't want the default underlining for our links, so we are going to turn that off. I'm actually going to format this a little differently than the others, just because it will end up looking nicer for that link section itself. So I'm actually setting two properties next to each other there along the same line. The next thing I'm going to do is set the visited links. The visited links will take on those very same values of color blue and text decoration none. Just because I don't care if you've visited the link or not, I want it to look the same. So I can either repeat those same settings, or I can also just put a:"link, a:"visited, since I want the exact same look for those. You wouldn't normally do that. Next is a:"hover. Now when they're hovered, we want a different effect to take place. We're going to keep the color blue, and we're going to bring the underlining into play, so it's text decoration, underline, and then when the link is active, meaning when you've clicked it, a:"active, we'll keep the underlining, but we'll change the color to red. So text decoration will be underlined when it's active or hovered. The order of these is important, and let's talk about that for a second, because you may have some conflicts. You could, for example, have a link that's been visited and you're hovering over it. So should it have text decoration or not? Because it's a:"visited, so it shouldn't, but we're hovering it, so it should. What's the browser to do? Then once you click on that link, your mouse is still hovering as you click, necessarily. So you basically have a link, it's visited, you're clicking it again, so it's active, but it's also being hovered. So what rule is it supposed to follow? In effect, it could follow any of these potentially 4 rules. In fact, that's why we need to order them link, visited, hover, active, because what we want is, if it's a link and it's visited, we want it to act like visited. But if we're hovering it, it should act like hovered. But if it's being clicked, it should act like active. So we need to actually put them in this order, because what CSS does is it takes the last rule and makes it highest priority and will override previous rules. So that's what we do. Enough talk. Let's see this in action. You can see right away our text decoration of none is in effect. Now when I mouse over, I'm getting the underlining on all three of these. It affects all three. When I click, it becomes active. You can see it turn to red. There's the mail to actually working. It's not active anymore, and it's just a visited link, which looks like regular links. But again, as soon as I hover over, I get that. And that's the same behavior for all these links. So there's our linking selectors. We need to come back now and take care of another div. I want to also take care of one thing that we're not doing yet, and that is we are not indenting yet these guys. These are H3s, and we want to indent them so that they are more clearly a part of this experience area. And up here, these degrees are more clearly a part of the education section. Right now, there's just too many headings that are left aligned. So we're going to create, down in the code, some tags to help us do that. Okay, in fact, it is this whole section that needs to be marked off under the education area to be indented. And under the experience area, likewise, a whole section that needs to be indented. So we're going to need divs. We can't use spans because it's multiple blocks that we're trying to work with. H3 and UL and another H3 and another UL. With those multiple blocks, we need to use divs. So I'm going to put a div here, and I want to close that div down here. And likewise, in the experience area, a div. I want the same indentation on both of these dived areas. Okay, now we're going to start running into the problem that when we did this selector before, we just said all divs. We certainly don't want an extra box with an extra border around those two areas. So we need to employ IDs and classes, because we're going to have another div here, and we need to tell which is which. The div I'm about to do needs to have margin left only, and it's going to have margin left of 30 pixels. The problem is, if we do it this way, we're going to have a mess on our hands because the divs can't tell each other apart. So I am getting the indentation. I'm getting the indentation, the margin left, on the outer div as well as the inner divs, and the inner divs are getting the boxes. You might say, hey, that's kind of cool, but it isn't at all what I wanted. But we need to differentiate these div areas. Okay. Now, the first div is actually the whole detailed resume area. This div is supposed to just mark off those individual areas. So we're going to come up with different names for these. I'm going to call the first one resume body. That's the outer div. And there's only one resume body, so I'm going to use an ID. Resume body is one word. If you want, you could put a dash between. But I'll just use it as one word. And then that div becomes div pound resume body. Okay, that makes sure that these settings of the border don't affect the other div. So we should have now taken care of the problem of the inner borders. We will still get the margin, however, on the outer div that we didn't want. So we sort of solved one of the two problems, the one that's most obvious. We no longer get the boxes on the inside. We do get the nice indentation on the inside that we were after. The problem remaining that we get this outer div indented 30 pixels, was it? Yes, that we were getting in here. So we have a little bit more work to do to stop that from happening. We give names to the inner divs, and there are two of them. So whatever name I'm going to give, it's going to be a class name. There's more than one. And I'll just call this details. There are resume details inside the education area. So div class equal details in both of those areas. And with those two divs given the same class name, I can affect both of them with div dot details. Again, it's pound for the ID because there's only one of them, and dot for the class because there's more than one of them. Alright, we should have now taken care of our issues. and come back and see that our box is in fact no longer indented. So we are selecting the right things to do what we want. Okay, and with that, I believe we have completed our task of formatting our resume document and getting along the way some good examples of when you use classes, when you use IDs, when you use divs, when you use spans, how to jazz up your links. That concludes our work today with selection. I hope you were able to absorb the various ways of selecting things. There certainly are other selectors and techniques to discuss, but these are the most important, most commonly used techniques to select, say, 90% of what you'll ever want to select. Very good. Happy selecting, and we'll see you in the next video.